You give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath. You restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. All the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry. These bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. All the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry. These bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. All the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry. These bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only.
How about you? I love that song. I remember the first time I heard that song, we were in the UK. As I said, this was the app this is how we did our music in the UK. And I remember the first time I heard it. I think it's been around for a while, but over there you don't really have access to Christian radio stations. You don't really have access to Christian music. And I heard that. And here's what I thought. First time I heard that song, when I die, I want that at my funeral. I mean, that's a powerful song. That's a really good song. I know we did it Sunday, and when I was picking out a song for tonight, I was talking with Gregory. I said, yeah, we did that Sunday. I think that'd be a good one to do. So that's a great song. Has anybody ever asked for or prayed for patience in their life before? we laugh. What happens when you do that? God tests your patience, doesn't he? Right? Because if you say, Lord, give me patience, and I'm almost cautiously saying that. If you say, Lord, give me patience, what does he do? He puts us in situations that test our patience. Yeah, brother. I can't wait till God gives me patience. I don't think we're ever going to have full patience until we're in the presence of the Lord. And that's one of those things. Now, here's a question I have for you. How does our society encourage impatience? How does our society encourage impatience? Why is that, Ralph? By advertising, yeah? In what ways, though? Yeah. You know, I had a business, and they had these things where you could offer financing to people. So, like, if what I'm charging you for is too much than you can afford, you could finance it, right? So if you want it now and you don't got the money, you can buy it now. That's one of the ways. What are some other ways that our society encourages impatience? Everything's, yeah. You know, and that's, I think this really comes from our sinful self-centeredness is really kind of where that comes from. And I've got to be guilty. I'm guilty of this one at times, right? If I want something done, you know, if I can't get somebody to do it, I'm just going to do it. You could ask Gregory. There'll be times I ask him to do something, and like today we were going to organize his office, but I did more organizing than he did because I'm just like, it's really a problem I have. You know, it's one of those things I'm working on, but I'm just kind of like, I'm always going, and I'm not, it's not so much like I got to have it now, but if I have something on my mind and I want to get it done, it's kind of like, this is one of the downfalls of pastors. Well, if I can't get somebody to do it, I'll just do it. And then you know what you do? You wear yourself out. You burn yourself out. And I don't know if you're like me, if you have that same personality trait. I think if I was a kid, I would have been diagnosed with ADHD. They probably would have heavily medicated me when I was a kid. But I mean, that's just one of those things. I was thinking of some ways, like some byproducts or some things we see of impatience. Like, have you ever been in line at a grocery store and it's really long? And you're like fifth in line and they open up the next aisle over? And instead of waiting for the person who's second in line to go over there, or you see that, all right, let me reword that because I know nobody in here would do that. But you see that line, and instead of, waiting for the next person in line, the person who's like 3, 4, 5 people behind just go rushing up there because they want to be first. Or have you ever come to a 4-way stop and it's your turn and somebody goes before you? And here's one that I've experienced multiple times. And you go to open up a door for someone who's older, or maybe someone who's disabled, and as I'm opening that door for them, somebody else who's completely capable cuts right in front of them. That's the kind of world in which we live. I think that's part of our self-centeredness. Yeah, Alice, you do that? Is that why you're raising your hand?
I was going to tell somebody else.
You didn't see me doing it, did you?
We get a close parking spot, a handicap, so he can go in quicker, so he doesn't have to walk very far.
Yeah.
We waited for like 5 minutes until these people got their car loaded with their groceries and everything, and got out of the way, and somebody zipped right in there.
Yeah. I think there's a country song about that. And how many times, and I don't know if I know we've never done this, but have you ever seen people who get impatient because you're waiting in a long line and the person in front of you just, they're struggling and they just don't have everything right, so it's taking longer, and you're like, come on, hurry up, let's go, I got to go somewhere. I've never done that. I probably got to be careful, right? But
The Word of God says the last will be first.
that's
When I used to go to buffets, I wanted to be the first person in line, make sure I got everything, and I'd always take too much.
yeah.
I'd go half other way. So I wait until everybody else is set, and then I go through.
I-
If there's not, I usually get more because I'll bring out better, hotter food anyway.
I was studying for this passage, and a lot of things came to mind. Because this is an issue, and James is talking about, now this chapter is going to start off, kind of interesting, and I want you to bear with me because it's really broken down into 2 parts, and almost when you read this, you think, how do these 2 things go together? James chapter 5, verse 1. Go to now, you rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. You have heaped treasures together for the last days. Behold, the hire of your laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth. And the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived in pleasure on the earth and been wanton, and have nourished your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and killed the just, and he does not resist you. It's the second half. This is where it gets a little confusing. Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience for it, until he receive the early and the latter rain. Be ye also patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. Take my brethren, the prophets, who have spoken in the name of the Lord, for an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. Behold, we count them happy which endure. Have you heard of the patience of Job? And have you seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy? But above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea and your nay be nay, lest you fall into condemnation. All right, here's a trick question. Does anybody understand what the context of these 12 verses are? And is there two parts to it? And what are the two parts? Let's start off with that. What two sections is this addressed into? And I'll give you a hint, verses 1 through 6 and then 7 through 12. What is verses 1 through 6 talking about? What's that? Oppression, yeah.
Can't take it when you die.
You can't, can you?
All the things you're working for the world. To me, it's about the world compared to working for heaven.
So who is Peter, or Peter? I was reading Peter this week, sorry. In fact, I was reading Peter yesterday, but who is James talking about in verses 1 through 6? Rich people. But more specifically, what rich people? What's that? Misery, but what rich people in the context of the book? Nope. Saved. Believers. He's addressing believers. Brethren. And from the very beginning, right? Because we know this because at the very beginning of the book, he's writing to my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. Now, there's the illustrations, right? You've got rich people, but he's addressing, what is the sin that you think he's addressing in here? Greed. Storing up, idolatry. Has anybody ever seen the show Hoarders? That's kind of like what he's addressing in here. He's addressing wealthy people that are amassing wealth, of course, not through biblical gain. And he's addressing that. And there's a symptom to it, which is the second half of it, about being patient, anxiety. And so it kind of all ties together. And it's kind of interesting when you read that. I was reading through the chapter earlier, and James does this thing. He addresses in multiple times, multiple areas, he addresses the wealthy. Why do you think he was addressing the wealthy believers?
Because God knew from the beginning money was going to be an issue and a problem.
Is money the issue? It's not. It's what you do with money, right? The root of evil, the love of money is the root of the evil, right? Because let's be honest, at the end of the day, this water's neutral. But if I worship this water, it becomes a god. Money's neutral. God allows it. God doesn't say that it is wrong, it is sinful to have wealth. Now, we could go to extremes and we could read some passages. We could take it out of context. But that's not what he's addressing. And I was thinking about this, and it really, really, really hit me hard. James, if you remember, mirrors the Sermon on the Mount, right? And as we're reading through here and we're seeing, right, the treasures that he's talking about. Your treasures, their gold and silver is cankered. Your clothes are moth-eaten. Does anybody remember the Sermon on the Mount where he talks about lay not up for yourselves treasures upon the earth, but lay up treasures in heaven? And here's something that we've got to get to, and this is what he's getting at. There was an issue, and in fact, I'm even going to go a little bit deeper in this, because there was something that I remember as I was studying. We're going to have the Lord's Supper here in a couple weeks. I'm waiting for the communion stuff to get here. As soon as it gets here, like when it gets here, we'll announce it a Sunday, then the next Sunday we're going to have the Lord's Supper. So it's coming up in about a week or two, whatever, anyhow. And I'm going to teach on what the Lord's Supper is, and I'm going to talk specifically about this passage. 1 Corinthians, I believe it's chapter 10, and I didn't study into this before tonight because it came to me tonight while I didn't eat dinner, but when I was at home getting ready to come here. You know, I don't know if you ever do this. Do you meditate on the Word of God? Yeah, have you read something and then you're thinking about it all day? And then just sometimes this is what happens is it's like Well, the Lord reminds you of something else. 1 Corinthians chapter 11? Yes, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Who's familiar with the Lord's Supper? And we've all done that. Who's familiar with communion? There we go. Okay. Do you know why we partake of communion? This is kind of like free. This is not even in my, I got notes and this is nothing in there, but this was good. And I thought this was good that we understand this. Why do we take it?
Because Christ initiated it.
It was a command. And as a Baptist church, we observe two ordinances. We observe baptism and the Lord's Supper. And the reason why we observe them, and they're ordinances, not sacraments, they can't save you, but we are to do them because they're commanded by Christ. Right? Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me until I come again. Go ye therefore into all the world, baptizing them. So these are commands. This is why we do it. This is why we hold to it in the Baptist church. Well, the Corinthian church, who's familiar with the Corinthian church? Who thinks the Corinthian church has good doctrine? All right, good. In the UK, they did. Or at least in the area we were in. And so in the Corinthian church, we know that Paul is correcting some serious errors. And so I'm going to teach, I don't know if I'm going to teach on this specifically or if I'm going to teach about the wedding feast and communion. There's a couple different communion messages that are really amazing. But here's what's happening in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17. Paul's addressing the Corinthian church. And I know we're thinking, well, rich people and anxiety. You're going to see how this plays into this. Because in the first century, there were people who were wealthy amongst believers. And they were using their wealth as a stumbling block. Do you think that happens today? It does, doesn't it? Even amongst believers. Now, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, now, they didn't have like us. They didn't have Lamborghinis. They didn't have mansions. But their wealth was in their clothes. And it was in like gold and stuff like that. And so actually, I won't read it too much. I'll just tell you where to look, and you can look at this later because of time's sake. But here's basically what was happening, and when I come to communion, we'll probably talk. I know we will address this, but what was happening in the Corinthian church was they would come together for a Baptist potluck. They would come together what was known as a love feast. Everybody would bring food, and they would bring it according to what they could afford. If you had a lot of money, you'd bring steak. I don't think they had steak back then, but the wealthy people would bring a lot. The poor people would bring little. The point of it was this, that everybody would eat, but that's not what they were doing in the Corinthian church. The wealthy people were eating. They were eating to excess. The poor people were not eating. They were suffering, and they were basically profaning. And during this love feast is when they would observe communion. And Paul's talking about it, and he's saying there were people, because of how vile they were doing this, that the Lord was actually taking, that were dying. And so I believe James was there at the Sermon on the Mount. I believe that's why we see so much illustration, so much allusion to the Sermon on the Mount when he's talking about the treasures laid up in heaven. I believe he probably would have understood this as well, because he probably would have been around, or at least had some ideas of what was going on at these love feasts and things like that. Why were they addressing it? Because it was an issue. And it can be an issue today, too. I mean, you could have people who are flaunting their riches. And really what James is getting at here in chapter 5 is it's kind of a twofold thing. He was really, the heart of it all, I'm getting way ahead of myself, but the heart of it all was this, that there were people that were wealthy, and it was a stumbling block. There were people who were using their wealth. He says, go to now, you rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. And here's what I believe. In fact, here's what I know. We can treat people badly, and we can even justify it sometimes. Oh, you know what? You were a little bit late, so you're not getting your full salary. Or whatever, and these people were doing just that. People were working, and they were ripping them off, and that's how they were getting wealth, and they were doing things that they shouldn't have done. But bigger than that was the fact that they had wealth, and it was really a stumbling block for them. Your riches are corrupted, meaning you have lots of riches. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Do you realize, who in here has more than one outfit? According to them, you would be extremely wealthy. Most people only had maybe one or two outfits. So if you were rich, you would have all these outfits. And what was happening was you were so rich that your outfits, the excess ones, have you ever heard of moths, I bit my tongue, moths and mothballs, and they didn't have mothballs back then, so moths would eat your clothes. And you would have gold, and if you remember in the Sermon on the Mount, right, they were burying their treasures in the ground because they didn't have safes. And thieves would come along, and they would break in and steal. They would dig through the mud walls and steal their treasures. They would dig into the ground. And he's even saying here, we know that gold and silver doesn't rust, but it cankers. And so they had so much of it that it was just kind of rotten away. I see this picture, I think it's on Facebook or something like that all the time. And I'm trying to think of who it is. It's like Kelly Clarkson or one of these people, their abandoned mansion. I look at this house, I mean, it's like really amazing, and I'm thinking, there probably is stuff like that. Or you see like these barns where you've got these antique Mustangs and these cars that are just rotting away. And I think, and you probably think this too, man, I wish I had that. You know, and there were people probably in the groups that James was writing to that didn't have clothes. And you had people that had excessive clothes to the point that moths were eating them. And there were people there that probably were financially struggling, that didn't have money. And the wealthy people had gotten their gain by taking advantage of. Because when it talks in here about them, verse 6, you have condemned and killed the just, and he does not resist you. Day laborers, if they did not work, they did not eat. And if you robbed them of that, or if you took advantage of them of that, basically there could be people who were suffering, who were hungry, and possibly were dying. Now, put that, once again, let's go back, put that in the context of believers. Now let's put it in modern day thinking. We're sitting in here and we're wealthy. I know, most of us aren't. Most of us are probably like me. You live paycheck to paycheck, you struggle, you try to save a little bit, you get by, you try to do good with what you have. But we're wealthy. Do you realize? I mean, who in here has had more than one meal today? In fact, I've got one waiting for me at home. When I get home, we've got dinner. I usually do that after Bible study. But the point is this, we've got food. We get to eat. We are a wealthy nation. But could you imagine if there were people in our church that were starving? And you could do something about it and you didn't? Or worse off, could you imagine if there were people in our church that were starving and here you've hoarded up stuff and you've actually been the one who's taken advantage of them so that they're starving? That's the kind of seriousness that he's addressing. So he's telling that, and I believe as I'm reading through here, and I was thinking this comes in the back of my mind, God knows. Right? We're going to be judged for this. We're going to be judged for how we treat people, what we do. Now, we're not going to lose our salvation. How do we know that? Well, we just taught on that, didn't we? We know we're not going to lose our salvation, but we're not going to also be laying up treasures in heaven. The works that we've done will just burn up and there'll be nothing. Have you ever seen, I always thought, have you ever seen a hearse with a trailer behind it of people's belongings? You know, and this was the issue, though, because if you're one of these people where you've got this massive wealth and you've got all this stuff, and there are fellow believers that are struggling, that have needs, and yet you die, and that stuff just goes on. And that's kind of what he's addressing in here. And it's really a sin, and it's really, when you look at it, it really becomes the sin of hoarding, because he goes in and he addresses it in the beginning, and he talks about what happens. He says, you know, you've got corrupted garments, your gold and silver's cankered. It's going to be a witness against you. It shall eat your flesh as it were a fire. If you have heaped treasures together for the last day. Yeah, these are good things, right? Your pastor's telling you, right? You're going to reap fire and... But he's being serious with them. He's like, check your hearts. But there's a deeper underlying reason why they're doing it, and that's the second half of the passage. Because I'm going to finish reading through. Behold, the hire of your labors, those who work for you, they've reaped your fields, and you've kept back their pay by fraud. And God hears their cries. You've lived in pleasure on the earth, and you've lived with excess. And you have nourished your hearts in the day of the slaughter. And verse 6, and you have condemned and killed the just. And he does not resist you. Transition. Verse 7. Be patient. And this applies to all of us, right? Because as we talk about patience, and it's hard when you read this, and it's hard to understand this because it seems like two thoughts, but they're two thoughts that come together into one problem. This second half is the reason why it's the first half. The reason why they're hoarding is the second half. Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience for it until he receives the early and latter rain. Be ye also patient, establish your hearts. For the coming of the Lord draws nigh. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge stands before the door. Take my brethren, he uses an example. Take my brethren, the prophets, who have spoken in the name of the Lord for an example of suffering, affliction, of patience. Behold, we count them happy which endure. You have heard of the patience of Job. Who's heard of Job and his struggles? Who in here has prayed to be Job? No one. And that's the funny thing, because Job was blessed twice, double what he started off with. We should pray more to be like Job. And what is the sermon? I'll go back to this is free too, the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew, I got to go here because this is just too good to pass up right now. Matthew chapter 5. It says, verse 10, Matthew 5:10, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men shall revile you, persecute you, shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Verse 12, right? Rejoice. Man, you're putting me down. You're insulting me. You're taking advantage of me. You're persecuting me. You're lying against me. Woohoo! Praise God. But that's what he's saying. You know why? And I've experienced this, and I've experienced this lately. And you know what? I could have just crawled into a shell. You know what? I love it when there's persecution. I love it when there's conflict in the church. I sound crazy, don't I? Mary said today I lost my mind. I've been kind of worked up. I've been kind of excited. And I understand why. You know why? Because when there's problems within the church, God is working. Amen. If we don't have any problems in the church, we better be afraid. You know, I'll give you the 7 signs of a dying church. And here's the reality. You could read that and you say, I don't want to do anything. And you can do what a lot of people will do. You can turn around, you can walk out the doors and never come back. That's okay. Because you know what? We're still going to move on. And you know what? We're still going to go out into Shelbyville, and we're still going to lead people to the Lord. And if you're here and you're a part of that and you begin to see lives change, you're going to see a joy that's going to be something so contagious. But if you leave, you're going to miss out on that. And if you hear of problems and you see of problems, because let me promise you, there are always going to be problems. And if you just don't like conflict, because that's really the big issue, and you're afraid of conflict, you're going to miss out on what's going to happen. You know, I'm serious. And there are things going on. I can't even talk about it, and that's okay. It's good. God is working. And I had to come to that, right? Matthew chapter 5. If things are happening, if there's problems, why is that? It's because God is working. And when God reveals sin, when God does it. Because this is what James is even talking about, right? There's this sin issue of wealth and hoarding and greed. And whenever it's confronted, there's problems. And it's a good thing. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. It talks about this is good when it happens because true leadership rises up in the midst of struggles. It's a good thing. I'm telling you. I'm warning. I'm telling you. I know you're sitting here like, what's going on? Don't try to add anything to it because that's gossip and that's sin. And I'll say this, and let me start with this too. I say this every Sunday, and I will say this continually. I won't bite your head off. But if you have a problem, if you have a complaint, a comment, a concern, my card is in the back. I'm available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if you don't come to me if you have a problem, or if you don't go to each other if you have a problem, it's sin. And if you go around and you talk, it's gossip, it's sin. You know, so we've got to be careful with that, because that is the canker, that is the stuff that comes into the church, right? It's this wealth, and it's this taking advantage of people, and it's this hoarding up stuff, and it's these every little thing, because I talked about this, this was yesterday at the pastor's meeting. I'm not going to go there, but 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 to the end of chapter 5, read it. It's powerful. It's really good, and I want to challenge you with that. But here's the thing. James is addressing this, and these are issues that are going on. People are hoarding stuff, and there's a reason, there's a symptom. We're going to address it.
Jesus taught in paradoxes, which I didn't know what it was until things that don't make sense that work. I used to think it was better to
Absolutely. And I think, and this is what I believe he's getting at, is what you're saying. If you've got the ability to meet someone's needs and you don't, right? I believe it's a sin. Absolutely. The sin of omission. The sin of being able to do it. And we don't like to talk about this because, right, we live in a day and an age where it's like, the one who gets the most wins. Chapter 5. Actually, let me ask you this question before we go on. How is piling up riches the opposite of patience that waits in faith for God to provide? Let me say that again. How is piling up riches the opposite of patience that waits in faith for God to provide? How is piling up riches the opposite of patience? That's it exactly. It's a faith issue. That's what James is dealing with, is a faith issue here. He's saying this: if you're stockpiling all this wealth and you're even doing it to the hurt of other people, why are you doing it? Because you don't have patience. Because you can't wait on the Lord. Because you don't trust the Lord. What are some reasons that you would stockpile riches or stockpile things? Greed, I know a better one. Worrying of your future, I know a better one. Think of modern day things think of modern media and things that have been going on. Hurricanes and the future, fear that something might come. The Y2K. I was a fireman, and I was on duty New Year's Eve, 1999, going into 2000. And we were told that we were going to have all of this, like computers are going to crash, people are going to be committing murder. And I mean, we did not know what to expect. And I only got up one time in the middle of the night. And it was for a medical. I slept better that night than I had most other nights at the fire department. I tell you, and it was crazy because the world thought we were coming to an end, and I believe the media can do this. And I believe the media is run by Satan. That's just my personal opinion, because you look at it and who drives all the narrative and who drives all the stuff that's going on in the world, but the media will do that. And I'll use a great example. Now, there is something to be said. When there's a hurricane coming, you need to take notice. The problem is every single hurricane that comes, they make it sound like it's going to be like this hurricane that hit. So you've got two things that happen. You've got those who hoard and stockpile and worry. Do you remember the toilet paper shortage? That wasn't even a symptom of COVID, diarrhea. And I remember we were in the UK and there was we were a family of 6 and we could hardly find toilet paper. And that's what the media does. And so what happens is every hurricane that's coming, everybody is trained. It's like Pavlov's dog. Hurricane, it's on the news. I believe Publix and Home Depot have something to do with that. The shelves are always emptied, and then 99% of the time, it never hits, or it's not as bad as they say it was going to be. The problem is that 1% when it does. And you've got how many people, because every one of us, we armchair quarterback this, right? Those people are so stupid. Why do they stay behind? The reason they stayed behind was because 99% of the time, it was nothing. And it's not cheap to evacuate, and it's not easy, and there's fear. If I leave and this hits and people are going to hoard my house, they're going to loot it, they're going to ransack it, because they do that too. And so we live in this fear, this perpetual state of fear. Oftentimes, I've been guilty of this. I've even been guilty of this lately. We make a decision based in fear. I don't want to do that because this is going to happen. I don't want to do that because it's going to cause conflict. And then I go back to what I said. We need conflict, right? We need to be doing what's right. And James is addressing this in here because he's telling them, be patient. How often are we patient? I mean, and what does James say about patience? Right? At the very beginning, he talks about it. How do we know that you're a spiritually mature believer? You've got patience. How do you get patience? Trials. Practice, yeah. It's being thrown in the fire and being burnt and going through all kinds of things. In fact, in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12 to the end, there's a section in chapter 5 that I absolutely love. This is for the young people in here. I'm going to go there. I can't help myself. It's too good to pass up. Here it is, 1 Peter chapter 5. I was reading this. Like, I was asked the day before the pastor's meeting to bring the devotion, and I've been looking at Psalm 37 for a while. I was going to do that. And then the Lord laid this on my heart because I'm with a bunch of pastors. And what do? Well, it is our job as pastors. I know I'm kind of strained, but it ties in. It is our job as pastors to basically, chapter 5, to feed the flock that is amongst us. But then as you read through there, you come across something that is really good. See, this is important for us, right? Verse 5, chapter 5, verse 5. This is something that we as a church, we do, and shame on us. Chapter 5, verse 5, likewise, you younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. That's not, the elder in there is not the elder, which would be at the beginning where they're talking about the pastor. You are under the leadership of the pastor, but what they're talking about is the older people. We've got our joy meetings on Tuesday, and they're fun. I mean, if you have not been to a joy meeting, you're missing out. They're a blast. And we call them just older youth because they're just like kids, and I say this because as you get older, you just kind of say what's on your mind. There's no filter, but here's what happens though. And this is where I have to be careful, and we have to be careful as a church. How often when we try to change things and we try to be relevant to society, do we take the older people into consideration? Right? See, we kind of throw them out. We throw, as they say, the baby out with the bathwater. We are so concerned about what we want. See, and Peter's hitting this. And this is kind of the same thing as James. He's hitting this, and he's making this point. We need to take what they know into consideration. Do you know why? I can't use me because I don't have hair, but if you look at Gordon, yeah, you look at Ralph, the few men who do have hair, Brother David, they got white hair. Do you know what that is? That's wisdom. Anna, Marcia, they've been through the fire. They know. See, but we think, and here's what happens in here, and this is really important. I almost taught on this tonight because it was really good, but we think we know everything, and we tend to, and he makes this point because this is the stuff that kills churches, right? What's he saying? He's saying to the pastors, feed the flock. He's telling the church, to the younger people, have respect of the older people. We miss that. And in fact, we're like, they're irrelevant. And I've told the older people, it is their job to reach out to the younger generation. We get these divides in the church. It's kind of like the wealthy, and we get these divides, and we don't want to, you know what? If you've ever sat around the stories, the experience, the things that people have been through, there are younger people that have lost kids. They've been there. There are younger people that are going through marital things, through all kinds of things. They've been there. And we miss out on a resource when we just kind of write it off. And then he also goes in there and he finishes up. I'm going to end with this. None of us, this happens, should be in such a position that we say it's my way or the highway. That's right in there in I think it's verse 5. Being clothed with humility, being subject one to another. That's a healthy church when it's not all about me. We see in an unhealthy church, and we see it a lot. If I don't get my way, I leave. If I don't like something, I leave. And this is twofold. This goes to the older generation and the younger generation. It's understanding that my generation maybe likes different music than your generation, so maybe we have a compromise, and instead of playing just my music, we play both forms of music. It's called balance. Balanced theology. That's what James is talking about. It's what Peter's talking about. It's what all the epistles talk about is balance. We got to have balance in everything. And that was the issue. You had these people in James's day who had extreme wealth, and they were doing it to the point that they were hurting other people. Some of these sections, or some of these symptoms of greed, was having no patience. It was often worrying, and worrying comes from a lack of money. Have you ever been in a situation where you don't have the money for something? I'm there all the time. And I got to say, I'll be honest. I love my daughter. She's here. She's more of an expense to me when she's here. I'm glad to have that expense. I'm not saying that as a burden. I'm serious. But that's the reality. When my son visited from Pensacola, when you eat out with 4 people instead of 5 people, nowadays it's more. It's significant. And so, the budgets and things like that, they change, and you've got to alter things. And so if you begin to worry, then you begin to do these things. You begin to stockpile. You begin to, I'm not going to give my tithe because I can't afford it. It's not about that. See, we've got to be good stewards with what God gives us. We've got to be able to plan it. And I understand it's hard, and sometimes we can't. Sometimes we just get by. But that's what we've got to do. That's what he talks about. So money's not the issue. It's the heart that's the issue. And that's what James is getting at. It's not about the money because wealth is neutral. Money is neutral. Here's what I've learned. If you're extremely wealthy and God is blessing you, it's probably because God is using you as a filter. I've known somebody like this. I knew a guy. He owned a business when we were in Springfield. He was one of the greatest givers I knew. He was wealthy, and God gave him more wealth, and he distributed it. He didn't drive around. He could have drove around a Ferrari. You know what he drove around in? I don't remember. I think it was like an old Ford pickup. And it wasn't so much about what I could have. He was a good steward. He had money. He would buy investments and things like that. That's not wrong. It was never his first priority. His first priority was serving the Lord. That's the way it should be. And that's kind of what James is getting at, because he's talking about this, and it's kind of that gray area. We see this. It's not a gray area. It's really black and white, but we see it as gray. We miss it. The signs of hoarding, the signs of extreme wealth. Because could you imagine, is anybody familiar with the first century church, the church in the book of Acts? What did they do? We'd be a cult if we did that today, wouldn't we? And in fact, I know a cult. We were from Clearwater. There was Scientology. And here's what they would do. They would come be a part of Scientology, the ones who walked around with the weird suits and rode on the buses and worked in the Fort Harrison Hotel, which you do not get in there unless you're a Scientologist. Even if you're a fireman, policeman, you do not get in there. They would give all of their wealth to the church. And the church would provide for them. I know it's kind of weird, because I'll say this because here's what happens. If I were to say, okay, everybody, here's what we're going to do. I know the next thing that would happen. Next Sunday, we're going to come together with everything that we own. We're going to bring it together, and we're going to distribute it evenly amongst ourselves. Sounds like socialism, or sounds like something like that, doesn't it? Right? And here's the reality. A lot of us are in the situations we're in because we made poor decisions, and it's not really fair. But if we were to say that, and that's kind of like what they did, but then they went one step further, and they would separate the husbands from the wives. They would separate the kids' wives so they could brainwash them. But it wasn't like that. See, it was different in the first century church. They would come together, and it wasn't like today, because it really kind of wouldn't work today. I mean, it would, but it wouldn't. But really, it works if we do it right. I mean, we probably can't come in with all of our real estate unless we bought like one big compound, and we would then be a cult. And the FBI would probably shut us down. But the point is this, is if we have people within our congregation that has needs, we could help them. I'm going to go back, and I do mean to step on your toes. 7 signs of a dying church. But we've identified in the church, this past week, I think we were like 152 people or something. We vary from like 150 to 180, and it's never consistent, and there's always an excuse why people aren't here. But we've identified there's like 51 people that consistently give. I'll be black and white, that's pathetic. But people misunderstand why you give to the church because they think that, I get it all and I'm wealthy. I don't, and I'm not. And even in Peter, they think that you do it because that's what happened, though, in the Bible. That's what they were addressing. That's what James actually was addressing, because the money would come in and they would, the pastor, he wasn't really the pastor, but the temple speaker would make all kinds of money, and that's why they wanted to do it. And here's the thing. There are needs within our church. I always say this, the gospel's free, but it's like water. It costs money to get where it's going. It costs money for buildings. It costs money for air conditioning. It costs money for heat. It costs money for driveways to be repaired and things like that. And we want to have something nice so when people come, because I always tell people, you can have a dead body outlined up here, and if you're a faithful church member, you just walk by it week in and week out. But if somebody visits for the first time, they'll never come back again. So we want to have something nice to present. And as a church, as a pastor, we have people contact us all the time who need help. And if more people gave, we would have more money so we could help more people. But it doesn't happen that way. That's the truth. I mean, that's hard. I'm doing that because we're with James and I can get away with this, right? Because he's pretty blunt. But that's the truth, though. And I mean, and when you leave here, I mean, that's the hard issue. And that's really what we deal with within the church. That's what James deals with. This is what all the epistles deal with. They deal with false doctrine. They deal with issues within the church. Why? Because from the very first century, it has never changed. It is always the same. There are always going to be problems. Why? Because we are sinful people, saved by grace, battling a sin nature, and our adversary, the devil, is walking around, and if you are not living for the Lord, he does not have to attack you. If you are living for the Lord and you're facing persecution and you're going through trials, that's evidence because Satan wants to destroy you. And if we don't have problems in the church, then that means that the church is not doing what it's supposed to do, and Satan already has us. And that's right where he wants us. But then if things come up and there's problems and there's issues and there's needs and we're not meeting the needs and we're not doing what the church does, Satan wins. And so as I said, it's really a hard issue. And we've got to decide day in and day out, right? If I got all kinds of money, we'll use that as the example, right? We'll go there. That's a hard. That's one nobody ever likes to talk about that part of the church. I don't mind talking about it, because here's what I can say as a missionary. I can say this, right? When we stepped out in faith and said, "Lord, I'll go wherever you want us to go," He always provided. I had to step, I had to trust, I had to do, and then He provided. I tell people it's like salvation because this is where people struggle with salvation. I'll stand up. Hopefully I won't kill myself. I would say salvation's like this, right? You're there and you're on the edge and you're looking, you know that you need something because your life is a train wreck and you know about Jesus and you've heard about Jesus and there's this step right here. But the problem is it's like kind of cloudy. And you've got to decide, am I going to take that step? Do I trust Jesus enough to take that step? But until you take that step, you don't realize that there's something there to catch you. And it's the same with giving because here's the thing, when you give to the Lord, I know we think, well, I can't afford to. You can't afford not to. But we don't do it because here's what happens. God gives to us. We see this in the Old Testament. And I'm not going on tithing or anything like that tonight. But we see in the Old Testament what they do. They gave first to God. Why? Because God gave us first. He gave us his best. And when we see this and we say, Lord, I trust you, you're going to be amazed at how he takes care of you. And I say that as a missionary because when we surrendered, the biggest thing I struggled with the fact that, Lord, how am I going to provide for my family? We never missed a meal. There were times it was tight. There were times that were lean. And you know what? God always had a blessing right there for us. And so here's what I want to challenge you with, and I can't make you. I don't want to make you. I always say this too. I mean, as far as church attendance, as far as giving, as far as anything like that, God don't want it if you don't want to give it. In fact, God don't need it. But you're going to miss out if you don't do it. That's the problem. But we miss out on blessings because, and here's what I want to say, if there's a need and you don't meet it and you can, you've missed out on a blessing. Here's the flip side. If you have a need, this happens all the time. This is a pride issue. If you have a need and you don't say it, you're robbing people of a blessing. And needs aren't always financial. I've got this disease. I've got cancer. I've got a problem. Will you pray for me? Praying is more powerful than anything money could ever buy. But until we as a church grasp this, until we get this family atmosphere, until we love each other, and we don't gossip and we don't talk, and we refuse to allow Satan to come in through those doors and attack us, he's going to win the victory. So until we stand strong, stand firm, until we stand firm in the word of the Lord, he's going to keep wreaking havoc. We're going to keep gossiping. We're going to keep doing things. I promise you this, there's always going to be problems in the church, and if you come in here some Sunday and there's no issues, no sound issue or no issue whatsoever, pray for persecution. Please. I'm begging you to. Pray for that. Because that means that we've gotten so calloused and so cold that it doesn't matter anymore. Father, I thank you for this passage. And even though it's a passage, it talks about money, but it really still relates back to a heart issue. People were hoarding because of fear, because of anxiety, because of lack of patience, lack of faith in you. And it's no different today. It's the same things that we do. We struggle with fear. We struggle with anxiety. We struggle with waiting on you. We struggle with conflict. We struggle with wanting to deal with issues because we're afraid of what might happen. There's such a beautiful thing as we look at scriptures, and I think in Matthew chapter 18, when there's problems between brothers. Instead of walking away and never speaking again, when there's a restoration, there's such a beautiful bond that is formed that brings two people closer together than ever before. But if we walk away, we miss out on that. There's things in the church that happen and will always happen. Praise God, because that's evidence that Satan is trying to destroy us. Father, I pray for this church. I pray for the heart of the people. I pray, Father, that you would use each and every one of us to actively be a part of this church, to see it be victorious in this community. See people's lives change because we would not give in, we would not quit. Father, I pray that you would start with me as the under-shepherd to be the example, to be the loving leader that this church needs. And I pray for our trustees and our board as they stand in the gap as well, that you would be with them, help them to stand strong in the faith, and be with the members, and be with those who come. Help each and every one of us to lift each other up so that we can stand strong and not fall victim to sin in our lives and sin in the church. Father, be with us as we leave here today. Help us to be your hands and feet where you would have us. Help us to see people's lives change because we are willing to do whatever you ask of us. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.